It had been 2 years since Mr. Desmond's beloved wife Clara passed away. The days without her were long, filled with quiet sorrow. Mr. Desmond was a successful businessman in the city of Jos, Nigeria, but even his wealth and success couldn't fill the emptiness that lingered in their home. His 2 children, Felix and Jody, felt the loss deeply as well. Felix, the older of the 2, was 18. He was a quiet and thoughtful young man who carried the weight of his mother's passing with a heavy heart. Jody, on the other hand, was only 9 years old. She was too young to fully understand the loss, but she missed her mother just the same. Despite their sadness, the siblings were very close, supporting each other through their grief and finding comfort in one another. Mr. Desmond knew that his children were struggling. Felix had always been the strong one, taking on the role of protector for his younger sister after their mother's death. But Felix had become withdrawn. He spent most of his time in his room, reading or thinking, far away from the warmth of the family he once cherished. Jody, on the other hand, tried her best to stay cheerful, though there was a sadness in her eyes that could not be hidden. 2 years had passed and Mr. Desmond realized it was time to move on. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but he knew that his life and the lives of his children had to continue. It wasn't easy for him to think of starting a new chapter, but he couldn't stay stuck in the past forever. So, after months of careful consideration, Mr. Desmond made a decision that would change everything. He would remarry. He met Jane, a lovely young woman who worked as a teacher in the city. Jane was 22 years old, just a few years older than Felix. She was kind-hearted, gentle, and humble. Though she was young, she had an old soul, and Mr. Desmond found comfort in her presence. She made him laugh, helped him rediscover the joy of living, and soon became the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. When Mr. Desmond introduced Jane to Felix and Jody, they were both polite but unsure about her. Jody, being young, accepted Jane without much hesitation, eager to have another female figure in the house. Felix was different. He had always been close to his mother, and the thought of another woman in his father's life was unsettling to him. He didn't express his feelings outright, but his actions spoke louder than words. He became distant, often retreating to his room or taking long walks outside. He was polite to Jane, but his behavior made it clear that he wasn't happy about the changes in their home. Mr. Desmond noticed the tension and it weighed on him. He didn't want to pressure Felix, but he also hoped that, with time, his son would come to accept Jane and their new family. For now, though, the house felt different and it was clear that something was off. Jane, being a kind and understanding woman, did her best to make Felix feel welcome. She tried to include him in family activities and was patient when he kept his distance. She had hoped that with time Felix would warm up to her, but as the days passed, things seemed to get worse, not better. Felix would sit at the dinner table barely speaking, his eyes often downcast. He would occasionally glance at Jane, but whenever their eyes met, he quickly looked away. His discomfort was palpable. Jane was worried. She had always dreamed of having a family of her own, and she wanted so much for her new family to be happy. But Felix's behavior made her wonder if she was making a mistake. "Don't worry," Mr. Desmond reassured her one evening as they sat in the living room. "He'll come around. It just takes time. He's had a lot of change in his life and it's not easy for him." "I understand," Jane said softly. "But it's hard, you know. I want him to be happy. I don't want him to feel like I'm replacing his mother." "You're not replacing her," Mr. Desmond said, his voice firm but kind. "No one can replace Clara. But life moves forward. Felix will see that in time." It wasn't easy for either of them, but they did their best. Jane continued to show Felix kindness and patience, hoping that her efforts would eventually pay off. As the months went by, something unexpected began to happen. Felix started to change, but not in the way anyone expected. First, it was subtle. Felix began to look at Jane a little longer than before. He would linger in the kitchen when she was making dinner, and he would sit near her on the couch when they watched TV as a family. Jane, though concerned, tried to ignore the growing unease she felt. She told herself that it was just a phase. Maybe Felix was just adjusting to the idea of having a new person in the house. But the more time went on, the more uncomfortable she felt. One afternoon, as Mr. Desmond was away at work, Felix approached Jane in the living room. She was sitting on the couch, reading a book, when he came and sat down beside her. She looked up at him, surprised by his sudden attention. "Jane," Felix said softly, his voice hesitant, "I need to talk to you." Jane closed her book, her heart racing. She could see the confusion in his eyes, the uncertainty. Of course, Felix. What's on your mind? Felix shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. I don't know what's happening to me. But I think I'm starting to feel something for you. Jane froze. She stared at him, unable to speak. Her mind raced as she tried to process what Felix had just said. The air between them grew thick with tension, and Jane felt a wave of nausea rise in her stomach. Felix, what are you talking about? She asked, her voice trembling. Felix finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of confusion and desire. I know it's wrong, but I can't help it. You're so kind, so beautiful, and I feel drawn to you. Jane's heart pounded in her chest. This was worse than she had ever imagined. What had begun as a subtle discomfort had now become something far more complicated. She didn't know what to say, how to make sense of it. She couldn't believe what Felix was suggesting. Felix, you have to understand, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. I am your father's wife. I'm married to him and you are my stepson. This can never happen. Felix looked down at his hands, his face red with shame. He didn't say anything more, but Jane could see the hurt in his eyes. He stood up and left the room without another word, leaving Jane to sit in stunned silence. The atmosphere in the house was now heavier than ever. Jane didn't know what to do or who to turn to. What had happened between her and Felix? Why had he felt that way? She couldn't fathom how things had spiraled so quickly, and she feared what would happen next. Days passed after Felix's confession, but the unease in the house only seemed to grow. Jane tried to carry on with her usual routine, but everything felt different now. Every time she saw Felix, she could feel the tension between them, an invisible barrier that neither of them could cross. Felix, once so quiet and withdrawn, now seemed to have a distant look in his eyes whenever they crossed paths. It was as if he was ashamed of what had happened, but at the same time he couldn't completely push the feelings away. Jane had always prided herself on her ability to remain calm in difficult situations, but this was something she couldn't ignore. Every time Felix was near, she felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She knew she couldn't let this continue, but she didn't know how to fix it. She had tried to approach Felix with kindness, to offer him space, to let him know that she was there for him as his father's wife and a friend. But it seemed to make things worse. He became more withdrawn, more distant. He hardly spoke to her anymore unless it was absolutely necessary, and when he did, his words felt colder than before. Jane started spending more time with Jody. Jody, bless her heart, had no idea what was going on. She remained her cheerful self, playing in the yard, enjoying her childhood. But even Jody couldn't escape the growing tension. She noticed that her brother was no longer as attentive, no longer involved in their family activities. His once easy smile had disappeared, replaced by a permanent frown. Jane had to admit to herself that she was worried about Felix. He was her stepson, but she cared for him deeply. She didn't want him to feel isolated or confused, but she also didn't want to cross any boundaries. One afternoon, while Jane was sitting on the porch watching Jody play with her dolls, she saw Felix walking slowly down the street. He looked lost in thought, his eyes distant. His body language was that of someone carrying a heavy burden. Jane hesitated for a moment but then stood up, calling out to him. Felix, can we talk? Felix stopped, his shoulders stiffening as if he had been caught in the act of something wrong. He turned to face her, his eyes guarded. I don't know if we need to talk, Jane, he replied, his voice low and hesitant. I think I've made things awkward enough already. Felix, Jane said softly, walking toward him. You don't have to avoid me. I care about you and I want us to figure this out together. What happened that day, it's not your fault. I think you were confused and I understand that. Felix shook his head, his gaze dropping to the ground. I don't know why I feel this way. It's wrong. I know it is. But I couldn't help it. I don't know what's happening to me. Jane took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. Felix, I understand that you're struggling. But you need to understand this. I am your father's wife. What you're feeling, whatever it is, cannot continue. It's not right and we need to find a way to stop it before it hurts everyone involved. Felix looked up at her, his face filled with confusion and frustration. I didn't ask for these feelings, Jane. I didn't choose them. It just happened. And now I don't know what to do. Jane's heart ached as she looked at him. She knew Felix wasn't a bad person. He was simply caught in the middle of something that he didn't know how to navigate. But she couldn't allow him to keep harboring these feelings. It wasn't fair to him, to her, or to Mr. Desmond. "You need to talk to someone, Felix," Jane said gently. "Maybe your father can help. Or a counselor. Someone who can help you understand these feelings and work through them. You don't have to carry this alone." Felix was silent for a long moment, his eyes wandering to the horizon. He looked as though he were wrestling with his own mind, trying to make sense of it all. "I'll try," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. Jane nodded, though she wasn't sure if he truly understood the gravity of the situation. Still, it was a step in the right direction. For now, all she could do was wait and hope that Felix would find his way through this confusion before it became something more dangerous. That night, as they sat at the dinner table, the silence was almost unbearable. Mr. Desmond had returned from work and was busy discussing business with a colleague over the phone. Jody was chattering away, oblivious to the tension, but Felix barely touched his food. He sat there, his eyes fixed on his plate, not engaging in conversation. Jane couldn't help but glance at him occasionally, her heart heavy with worry. She wanted to reach out to comfort him, but she didn't know how. She was trapped in a delicate balance, trying to be a mother figure to him without crossing any boundaries. After dinner, Mr. Desmond noticed the strange atmosphere. He set down his glass of wine and looked around the table. "What's going on?" he asked, his brow furrowing in concern. "You two have barely said a word all night." Jane opened her mouth to speak but found herself at a loss for words. Felix, too, remained silent, his gaze still fixed on the floor. Mr. Desmond turned to him. "Felix, what's going on? Is everything okay?" Felix looked up at his father, his face filled with conflict. For a moment he seemed as if he might say something, but then he shook his head and muttered, "I'm fine, Dad. Just tired." Mr. Desmond didn't seem convinced, but he let it go. The rest of the evening passed in silence, and as soon as dinner was over, Felix retreated to his room without a word. Jane felt a tight knot in her stomach as she watched him go. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but she didn't know how to fix it. The days dragged on, each one filled with the same unspoken tension. Jane spent more time with Jody, trying to keep the atmosphere light for her sake, but she couldn't ignore the growing rift between her and Felix. She knew it wasn't healthy, but every time she tried to address it, Felix shut her out. She was beginning to feel helpless, unsure of how to reach him. But deep down, Jane knew something had to change. Felix couldn't continue to struggle with these feelings, and the longer they went unspoken, the worse it would get. It was time to face the truth, no matter how difficult it was. Section 3. The Confrontation. The days that followed were a blur of unease and confusion. Jane tried to stay patient with Felix, but she could feel the growing distance between them like a heavy weight. Every time they crossed paths, she couldn't help but feel a pang of discomfort. It was as though a cloud hung over the house, and no matter how hard they tried, it wouldn't lift. Felix, for his part, seemed increasingly withdrawn. He didn't spend as much time at home as he used to. He'd often leave for long walks, sometimes not returning until late at night. Jane noticed the way his eyes would flicker toward her every now and then, his gaze filled with something she couldn't quite place: guilt, longing, confusion. But every time their eyes met, he quickly looked away as if ashamed of the emotions he was carrying. It was clear to Jane that Felix was struggling, but she couldn't allow this to continue. She could no longer pretend that everything was fine, that the family was functioning normally. Something had to be done. She couldn't stay silent anymore. For her own peace of mind and for the sake of the family, she needed to confront Felix about what was happening. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the quiet streets, Jane found Felix sitting on the porch. His head was lowered, his face a mask of thoughtfulness. Jane stood at the doorway for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know if she was ready for this conversation, but she knew it had to happen. Taking a deep breath, she walked outside and sat down beside him. Felix didn't look up, but he knew she was there. He could feel her presence beside him, the weight of her concern pressing against him. "Felix," Jane said gently, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "We need to talk." Felix looked up slowly, his eyes full of resistance. He didn't speak, but his body stiffened, as though he were preparing for a fight. Jane swallowed the lump in her throat, searching for the right words. "I know things have been strange between us," she began. "I know you've been distant and I know you're struggling. But we can't keep ignoring this. We need to talk about what happened. Felix's eyes darted away from hers, his expression closing off. I don't know what to say, Jane, he muttered, his voice barely audible. I never asked for this. This happened. Jane could feel the frustration building within her. She needed him to understand, to see how serious this was. Felix, I care about you, but what you're feeling isn't healthy. I'm your father's wife. You're my stepson. This can't happen. We can't allow this to continue. Felix clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He looked as if he were holding back tears. I know it's wrong. But I couldn't help it. I don't know why I feel this way. Jane's heart broke for him, but she knew that sympathy wasn't enough. She needed to be firm to make him understand that this wasn't just about their emotions. It was about boundaries, respect, and family. I don't think you really understand what's happening, Felix, Jane said softly but firmly. You're confused, and I understand that. But this isn't just about feelings. It's about family, about the life we've all been trying to rebuild. If you don't get help, if you don't talk to someone about this, it will only make things worse. Felix looked up at her, his eyes wide with fear. What do you mean, help? You think I'm some kind of freak? No, Felix, Jane replied, her voice steady. You're not a freak. But these feelings you have, they're dangerous. Not just for you, but for all of us. You need to talk to someone. You need to understand why this is happening. Felix's face twisted in anguish, as though he were battling with his own mind. He stood up abruptly, pacing in front of her. I don't know what's wrong with me. I hate feeling like this, like I'm doing something bad just by thinking. But it doesn't stop. It doesn't go away. It's like there's this voice in my head telling me that it's okay, that it's normal, but I know it's not. Jane stood up as well, her heart aching for him. She wanted so badly to take away his pain, to fix everything for him, but she knew she couldn't. Felix, this is not normal. You need to talk to your father. Or a counselor. Someone who can help you understand what's going on inside your mind. I can't fix this for you, but I can help you get the help you need. Felix stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression torn between defiance and sorrow. I don't want to tell Dad. He'll be angry with me. He'll hate me. Jane shook her head. Your father won't hate you, Felix. He loves you. But he needs to know what's going on. It's better to talk to him now than let this continue and ruin everything. Felix's hands shook and he closed his eyes tightly, trying to block out the emotions that were threatening to overwhelm him. I don't know if I can do it, he whispered. Jane reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to offer comfort without crossing any boundaries. You don't have to do it alone. You can get through this. But you have to make the choice to get help. You have to take that first step. There was a long silence between them, filled only by the soft rustling of the wind in the trees. Felix didn't say anything. Jane had been holding her silence for far too long. The tension in the house had grown unbearable, and no matter how much she tried to act normal, the truth weighed heavily on her. Felix's lingering glances, his sudden changes in behavior, and the strange energy he brought into every interaction, it was all too much. She had tried to manage it on her own, hoping the situation would resolve itself, but it was clear now that it wouldn't. One evening, as the golden hues of sunset faded into the cool tones of twilight, Jane decided she couldn't keep this to herself anymore. Mr. Desmond was sitting at the dining table, poring over documents for his business. Jane watched him from the doorway for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't want to disturb his peace, but she knew she couldn't ignore this any longer. Desmond, she said softly, stepping into the room. He looked up, smiling at her. Hey Jane. What's on your mind? Jane hesitated, twisting her hands nervously. Can we talk? It's important. Sensing the seriousness in her tone, Mr. Desmond immediately set his papers aside. Of course. What's going on? Jane sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. It's about Felix. Mr. Desmond frowned, concern flashing in his eyes. Is something wrong? Has he done something? Jane nodded, her voice trembling as she spoke. I don't know how to say this, but Felix has been acting strangely around me. He's been giving me these looks, and his behavior, it's made me feel uncomfortable. Mr. Desmond's expression grew more serious. What kind of behavior, Jane? Be specific. She hesitated, unsure of how to put her feelings into words without sounding accusatory. It's the way he looks at me, Desmond. It's not the way a stepson should look at his stepmother. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then he started acting differently. He's withdrawn, but when we're alone there's this tension I can't ignore. And one afternoon, I asked him directly if he realized I'm his father's wife. He didn't deny it. He just walked away. Mr. Desmond leaned back in his chair, his face a mixture of disbelief and anger. Jane, are you saying that Felix has feelings for you? Jane nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I didn't want to believe it, but yes. I think he does. And it's making it hard for me to feel comfortable in my own home. I don't know what to do, Desmond. I love you and I love this family, but I can't pretend this isn't happening. Mr. Desmond's jaw tightened and he looked away, his hands gripping the edge of the table. For a moment he was silent, processing what Jane had just told him. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, though laced with anger. I don't know what to say, he admitted. This is not something I ever expected to hear. Felix has always been a good boy. Troubled, yes, after his mother's passing, but never anything like this. Jane reached out, placing a hand on his. Desmond, I don't think he's a bad person. I think he's confused and maybe he doesn't even fully understand what he's feeling. But it's affecting me and it's affecting the household. We need to address it before it gets worse. Mr. Desmond nodded slowly, his face etched with worry. You're right. This isn't something we can ignore. I need to talk to him. He needs to understand that this behavior is unacceptable, and he needs help to figure out why he's feeling this way. But please, Desmond, Jane added quickly, be gentle with him. He's struggling and I don't think he's doing this to hurt anyone. He's just lost. Mr. Desmond looked at her, his eyes softening. I understand, Jane. I'll handle it carefully. Thank you for telling me. I can't imagine how hard this must have been for you. Jane nodded, relieved that she had finally shared her burden. I just want this family to heal, Desmond. I want us to be happy. Mr. Desmond stood and walked around the table, pulling Jane into a comforting embrace. We will be, Jane. We'll get through this together. I promise. Later that evening, Mr. Desmond found Felix sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the television. The flickering images cast shadows across his face, making him look older and more troubled than he was. Felix, Mr. Desmond said, his tone serious but calm. Felix looked up, startled. Yeah, Dad? We need to talk. Turn off the TV. Felix hesitated, but he obeyed, reaching for the remote and silencing the room. The sudden quiet was deafening, and Felix could feel his heart pounding as he waited for his father to speak. I had a conversation with Jane, Mr. Desmond began, sitting down across from his son. She told me about your behavior toward her. About how it's made her feel uncomfortable. Felix's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Is there something you want to tell me, Felix? His father pressed gently. Felix lowered his head, shame washing over him. I didn't mean for this to happen, Dad, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to feel this way. I know it's wrong. I don't know what's wrong with me. Mr. Desmond's heart ached as he listened to his son's confession. He could see the pain and confusion in Felix's eyes, and it was clear that the boy was struggling deeply. Felix, he said softly, I'm not angry with you, but I am worried. What you're feeling isn't something you can handle on your own. You need help, someone to talk to, someone who can help you understand why this is happening and how to move past it. Felix looked up at his father, tears streaming down his face. Do you hate me, Dad? Mr. Desmond leaned forward, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. I could never hate you, Felix. You're my son and I love you. But we need to work through this together. This isn't just about you. It's about our family, about healing and moving forward. Felix nodded, his tears falling freely. I'll do whatever it takes, Dad. I just want things to go back to normal. Mr. Desmond squeezed his shoulder gently. We'll get there, son. One step at a time. The days that followed Felix's confession marked the beginning of a transformative journey for the family. Mr. Desmond wasted no time arranging for Felix to visit a therapist. While Felix had initially been nervous, he quickly realized how much he needed an outlet for his emotions. During his first session, Felix hesitated to speak, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt as the therapist, Dr. Rebecca, observed him with a kind smile. You don't have to rush, she said gently. This is your space, Felix. Take your time. Felix exhaled deeply and began to talk about his mother. He shared how her absence left a void in his life that seemed impossible to fill. When Jane came into our lives, he admitted, it felt like she brought light back into the house. I think I started confusing that light with something else. Dr. Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. It sounds like you were searching for comfort, for a way to feel whole again. And Jane, as a kind and supportive figure in your life, became a symbol of that comfort. These feelings you've been experiencing, while they're difficult and confusing, don't make you a bad person, Felix. They're a sign that you're still processing your loss. For the first time, Felix felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't a monster or a failure. He was a young man grappling with emotions he didn't yet fully understand. At home, things began to shift as well. Mr. Desmond and Jane worked hard to create an environment of openness and support. Jane in particular showed incredible patience and understanding. She never treated Felix with resentment or suspicion. Instead, she went out of her way to reassure him that he was still an important part of the family. One evening, as Jane prepared dinner, Felix cautiously approached her in the kitchen. "Jane," he began, his voice hesitant, "can I talk to you for a moment?" She turned to him, setting down the knife she was using to chop vegetables. "Of course, Felix. What's on your mind?" He took a deep breath. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. For making you feel uncomfortable, for making things hard around here. I never meant to hurt you." Jane's eyes softened and she smiled gently. "I know you didn't, Felix. And I forgive you. What matters now is that you're taking steps to understand yourself and grow from this. That's what's truly important." Felix nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "Thank you," he said quietly. As months passed, Felix's therapy sessions became less about his feelings for Jane and more about healing the emotional wounds he had carried since his mother's passing. Dr. Rebecca guided him through exercises to confront his grief, his anger, and the guilt he had buried for so long. One day, during a session, Dr. Rebecca asked him a pivotal question. "Felix, what do you want for your future?" The question caught him off guard. He had spent so much time dwelling on his past that he hadn't considered what lay ahead. After a long pause, he finally said, "I want to feel happy again. I want to focus on my studies, on my family. I want to be someone my dad and Jody can be proud of." "That's a beautiful goal," Dr. Rebecca said with a smile. "And it's entirely within your reach. Remember, Felix, healing is a journey, not a destination. Be kind to yourself along the way." 1 year after the events that had shaken their family, Felix returned home for a visit after spending time living with his uncle on the island. The distance had been good for him, giving him space to focus on his studies and continue his therapy without the constant reminders of his previous struggles. When he arrived at the family home, he was greeted by Jody, who threw herself into his arms with a squeal of delight. "Felix, I missed you so much." He laughed, spinning her around before setting her down. "I missed you too, little one." Jane and Mr. Desmond were close behind, their smiles warm and genuine. Felix couldn't help but notice how much more peaceful the house felt. It was as if the shadows that had once loomed over them had finally lifted. Over dinner that night, the family laughed and talked about everything. School, work, Jody's latest antics. For the first time in what felt like forever, Felix felt like he truly belonged. Later that evening, Felix sat with his father in the living room, the two of them sipping tea as they talked. "Dad," Felix began, his tone serious, "thank you for everything you've done for me this past year. For sending me to Uncle's, for supporting me through therapy. I don't know where I'd be without you." Mr. Desmond smiled, his eyes filled with pride. "You don't have to thank me, son. I'm your father. It's my job to support you no matter what. And I couldn't be prouder of the progress you've made. You've grown so much, Felix." Felix looked down at his cup, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I still have a lot to work on, but I feel like I'm finally moving forward. And that's because of you, Jane, and this family." Mr. Desmond reached over, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "We're always here for you, Felix. No matter what." As the weeks turned into months, the family found a new sense of normalcy. Felix continued to focus on his studies, excelling in his courses and setting his sights on a bright future. Jody remained the heart of the family, her boundless energy and joy bringing everyone closer together. And Jane and Mr. Desmond's marriage grew stronger, their bond deepened by the trials they had faced together. They had weathered the storm and come out on the other side, their love and commitment unshaken. For Felix, the journey wasn't over, but it was no longer weighed down by shame or confusion. He had found clarity, purpose, and peace, and for the first time in years he was excited about what the future might hold.